So let's talk a little bit about books 1 through 6, which you're going to read for this week. And as you know, as part of your assignment, I've asked you to go into a wiki area of our webpage and create a entry that enhances your classmates' understanding in some way of one of four aspects to books 1 through 6. Now, you don't have to choose something from every book, but choose something from one of the books that interests you around the four um, ideas of either geography, where is Odysseus, or where is Telemachus? Can you shed some light on that for your classmates by picking a specific line from one of the books and then perhaps finding an image somewhere, a map, or even, you know, National Geographic Earth or something that zooms down on modern day location of what's mentioned in one of the books in terms of their journey? Or could you find some aspect of Greek culture in one of the books 1 through 6 and pull that out and then perhaps find some illustration or something that enhances your classmates' understanding of that aspect of it? For example, a reference to Greek hospitality, which is so important to the success of Odysseus and his journey. If he wasn't welcomed warmly in many of the places he was and given a gift as he left, certainly his journey would not have been as successful. That goes the same for Telemachus. Something about the Greek gods that are mentioned. Is there a god mentioned that you would like to pick out and give a little bit more information on, add to the wiki, and then perhaps find some sort of illustration for that Greek god, or perhaps just a character, not necessarily a god, but a character that's mentioned in one of books 1 through 6. And then again, give us the line that you're referring to directly from the text and in some way illustrate that to us. Now, I'll begin the wiki. I will post my own sort of image. I'll pick something out of books 1 through 6 that I'm interested in and that I'd like to share with you, and then I'll put that up, and that can sort of be your guide to what you might put up there yourself. It could be something like a piece of art. It could be something like a video clip. It could be a map. It could be an image of a place. It could be information about something to do with mythology, about the Greek gods. Whatever you do use, though, I would like to see you cite your source. If you get your information off of Wikipedia, if you get it off of, you know, Perseus.org, which is a useful site, if you get it off of an educational.edu site, or if you get a map off of, you know, as I said, National Geographic Earth or something like that. I'll actually put on our menu side something called external links, helpful links, and that will list some sources that you might use to find images. Certainly you could find great pieces in museums that are images of the story actually told in pieces of pottery, something like that. There are beautiful paintings done of the Odyssey. So when you're reading books 1 through 6, bear in mind those four sort of aspects. Where where is the character? So that would be geography. Is there a reference to Greek culture, something about food or wine or hospitality, a tradition that you could pluck out and kind of talk about in more depth on our wiki page? Is there a character that you find interesting that you'd like to know more about that is mentioned and you do a little research and you can shed some light on for the rest of us? Or perhaps, again, something to do with Greek mythology, a god, a place, um, incident in Greek mythology that you stumble upon in the books 1 through 6 and you find interesting. And so our wiki will actually then become for all of us kind of this learning page, this ongoing dialogue with each other in which we educate each other a little bit into areas of the text that we find interesting. Thought I would do in this video is just go through a little bit of book one with you and give you sort of an idea of how I would approach reading each book and how I would like you to kind of think about reading each book as you go forward. So if we begin, and if you take out your Fagel and you want to follow along with me, that's fine. You can always pause me here and then come back. So in book one, I just want to read directly from the opening. So book one is entitled Athena Inspires the Prince. Sing to me of the man, Muse, the man of twists and turns, driven time and again off course. Once he had plundered the hallowed heights of Troy. Now, who's saying this? You have to sort of put yourself in this frame of mind where you're kind of thinking about who's speaking, what they're saying. So if the first line is sing to me of the man Muse, we have to assume that this is Homer. Homer again is this bard, someone who is a poet, and a muse is someone who inspires writers or inspires painters or artists. And Homer is asking the muse to sing to him of this man that had many twists and turns, driven time and again off course after he had plundered the hallowed heights of Troy. So clearly, right away, we know that Homer is writing about Odysseus's journey and that it wasn't a smooth one. He was driven again and again off course. And he's a man of many twists and turns of fate. But he had plundered the hallowed heights of Troy. Well, he had plundered Troy. He was one of the heroes of the great um, Iliad, the great Trojan War, told in the Iliad. So immediately we have the poet Homer asking for inspiration to hear about the great Odysseus. And that's kind of how we know that this is a sung tradition. So Homer begins, as I said, by actually not introducing his main character at all, but telling us a little bit about the prince who's left behind. So Athena is inspiring the prince, and the prince is Odysseus' son, Telemachus. And so one of the first introductions to Athena, and one of the things I asked you to think about for this week, is the epithets that Homer uses to describe the characters. One of the first epithets used to describe Athena is in line about 53 on page 79 in the Fagles edition. And sparkling-eyed Athena drove the matter home. Sparkling-eyed Athena. So Homer uses these wonderful epithets, and I've asked you to find some for each of the characters or for some of the characters as you go along, or to note them, maybe highlight them. They're the little descriptor used immediately before the character's name that gives us, the reader, some kind of insight into who the character is and what they're like. So obviously the sparkling-eyed Athena sets up the goddess Athena as quite vibrant, sort of perhaps a little devious or, full of energy and wonder. And certainly she is, because really Athena is the guide for not only Telemachus initially, but certainly throughout Odysseus's journey. She has been his guide home in many ways, his protector, his advisor. She comes in many guises, very rarely as herself, and we'll talk about why that is as well. So she is this wonderful character. And one of the things I would say to the young women out there reading the Odyssey, I know that even myself as an English major, much of the great literature that I was reading throughout my college life and my graduate school world was what we call written by dead white men. And it's only recently that women of color or women at all have come into what they call the traditional canon of literature. But having said that, I would argue that Homer is quite fond of women in some ways, maybe perhaps an early feminist, because most of the women in the Odyssey are heroines of their own right. So, although you're reading about the great hero's journey, and the great hero's journey certainly is about Odysseus, I would say to you, as young women, that take heart that some of the women mentioned in the Odyssey are quite strong and quite admirable. Athena being one, Athena really being responsible for Odysseus's success. Without Athena, you could argue that would have been impossible for him to get home. Penelope is another very admirable female character, and although perhaps not so admirable, certainly Calypso and Circe are powerful and interesting female characters. So perhaps Homer was a little bit of an early feminist, and at least as women readers, we can find some enjoyment in the fact that the female characters themselves are also strong heroine type characters. But getting back to Athena being mentioned around line 53. So the sparkling eyed would be one of what I called the epitaphs that I asked you to look at. And that's something I would highlight then as, in fact, I have highlighted it here. It would be the sparkling, I don't know if this is going to be very clear, probably not, the sparkling eyed Athena drove the matter home. She's in this paragraph on page 79 arguing with her father Zeus about Odysseus, imploring him to take pity on Odysseus. He is Zeus, after all, the king of the gods, and her father. And she's imploring him to take pity. Now, one of the things that becomes immediately clear as a result of this is that the gods, in fact, in Greek culture, were responsible really for what happened to humans. They were humans were a little bit like puppets on a string, that the gods, the Greeks believed, certainly Homer would have believed, that the Greeks had a great deal to do with what went on in the human world. And so Athena, having a great fondness for Odysseus, we'll see that throughout the poem, implores her father to take pity and help him, that he is languishing with Calypso on this island and wanting to get home. And in fact, she does intercede for Odysseus. So if we just read a little bit further, my heart breaks for Odysseus, she says to Zeus, that seasoned veteran, cursed by fate so long. So, seasoned veteran, we know that he's an old warrior, cursed by fate so long. So, the term fate comes in very early on in the Odyssey. We realize that fate plays a hand in Odysseus's travels. And obviously, he's been away so long and cursed by his fate. So we don't know at this stage how cursed or in what way, but certainly we know that at this stage he's already been cursed by fate. Far from his loved ones still, he suffers torments off on a wave-washed island rising at the center of the seas. A dark wooded island, and there a goddess makes her home. And then she's referring to Calypso, the goddess Calypso, who's really holding um, Odysseus captive. And she's actually half goddess. She's Atlas's daughter, Atlas being one of the gods, and her mother was a human or a nymph. So she is holding him captive. Luckless man, despite his tears, forever trying to spellbind his heart with suave, seductive words. and wipe all thought of Ithaca from his mind. So see, the term even seductive has come in already, that this is one of his temptations on his journey. Calypso, a seductress, is keeping him from making any progress home towards his family. And so she says to Zeus, but he, straining for no more than a glimpse of hearth smoke drifting up from his own land, Odysseus longs to die. Aside from the fact that he longs to have some hope of seeing Ithaca again, he would just as soon die. And she says, Olympian Zeus, have you no care for him in your lofty heart? Did he never win your favor with sacrifices burned beside the ships on the broad plain of Troy? So the gods really took the Greeks' side in the Trojan War. And so by winning the Trojan War, Odysseus actually gained a lot of favor with the gods. And so it is in Zeus's probably interest to bring Odysseus home and reward him for his hard fought battle at Troy. And he goes on to answer her, my child Zeus, who marshals the thunderheads, in other words, he's in charge of the thunder in the sky, replied, what nonsense you let slip through your teeth. Now, how on earth could I forget Odysseus, great Odysseus? This is the first epitaph for Odysseus. Remember, we haven't met him ourselves. We only hear about him through others like Athena and now Zeus. And the king of all the gods is using the term great as the descriptor for Odysseus. So you'll notice there are many descriptors of Odysseus. Um, um, Athena had said long suffering Odysseus in terms of him being stuck on Calypso's island. But now, when Zeus speaks about him, he speaks of him as the great Odysseus. So that again is an epitaph that you could highlight, and that indicates something about Odysseus that Homer wants us to know. Well, what does that tell us? That tells us that the greatest of gods thinks very highly of Odysseus, and that he himself acknowledges the greatness of this man. And then he goes on to talk about who excels all men in wisdom, excels in offerings too. And that's sort of a glimpse into Greek culture, because what Zeus is saying is he appreciates Odysseus because Odysseus excels in offerings. In other words, offerings to the gods, acknowledging the gods as being responsible for his successes and whatever great attributes he has. He's obviously a man of great strength, of great prowess, of great intellect, but he doesn't take any of that for granted. He always gives homage, pays homage to the gods for all of his blessings, for all of his attributes and characteristics. And so the gods really appreciate this about Odysseus. And then Zeus goes on to give us some insight into why Odysseus has been held captive, why he's sort of the long-suffering Odysseus who has been cursed by fate. And Zeus tells us that no, it's the earth shaker, Poseidon. Now, the earth shaker would be the one that would cause earthquakes, and earthquakes come up generally through the sea. Poseidon, so Poseidon, the god of the sea. So if you're traveling from Troy to Ithaca, a long journey, if I can find sort of a map to show you. And you are at the mercy of Poseidon, the one god you don't want to anger is the god of the sea, who, if you do anger, your fate is sort of sealed, because the way you're traveling is by boat. And if you've ticked off the god of the sea, you can pretty much assume that your journey will be ill-fated, because the god of the sea is working against you. So I do have this map to kind of indicate present day um, where we're talking about. So if you look at where Troy is on the map, it would be in present day, I think that's coming out too clearly, but present day Turkey. And obviously these lines are showing Odysseus's journey all, you know, around the Mediterranean and all these places, and then back towards um, this area around Greece, which is where he ends up, Ithaca. So if you are taking this long kind of journey um, through the sea, and the one god who is sort of working against you is the god of the sea, then you know you're going to have a long and arduous journey ahead of you. So what Zeus is saying is, why are you asking me about Odysseus? I would be happy if he was able to come home, but it's the god of the sea who is working against him. Now, the three main gods really are Zeus, Poseidon, and Hades. They would be sort of the main gods. So it would be kind of hard, although Zeus is the big god of all gods. Still, Poseidon is a very powerful god and certainly powerful in terms of anything that goes on with the sea. And so, what's interesting is that Athena presses her father a little bit and says, Father, son of Cronus, our high and mighty king, and this is on page 80, if now it really pleases the blissful gods that wise Odysseus shall return. Now, again, that's a lovely epitaph. That's a descriptor of Odysseus. That gives us information about Odysseus. The gods believe him to be wise. We know that he's probably very clever. Um, that the wise Odysseus shall return home at last, let us dispatch the guide and giant killer Hermes to the island, down to announce at once to the nymph with lovely braids our fixed decree. In other words, let's send Hermes, the messenger god, to the nymph, being Calypso, our decree, what we want to happen. We want her to let him go so that he can get home. Odysseus's journey home, the exile must return, while I myself go down to Ithaca, rouse his son to a braver pitch, inspire his heart with courage, to summon the flowing-haired Achaeans to full assembly, to speak his mind to all those suitors, slaughtering on his droves of sheep and shambling longhorn cattle. So in that paragraph, there's quite a bit that goes on. We hear that she is asking Zeus to send Hermes to Calypso's island and say to Calypso, hey, his fate is to return home. His exile is over. But she also says, while I myself go and rouse his son to a braver pitch. That's just a lovely way to say that she needs to give Telemachus the courage he needs until his father returns. The courage to, now the Achaeans are the same as the Greeks. Don't get confused about that. Whenever the Achaeans are mentioned, it's just another term for the Greeks. The Achaeans are the ones who live on Ithaca and under Odysseus's rule. And she's saying that Telemachus will bring them together and try to gain their support to keep these suitors who are after his mother at bay until the father returns. And so we hear that Athena is going to kind of intervene on Telemachus's behalf. So in book one, it's really more about, I mean, we get some insight into what's happening to Odysseus, yes, but of course we don't meet him. It's all secondhand. But it's really the story of Telemachus and how Athena is going to sort of give him the courage he needs to become a man. And it's the coming of age, the growing up of Telemachus. So if you go to page just to, I think, we go to sort of page 83, we can see that um, she meets up with Telemachus, and she's coming though not as herself, and this is another thing we want to look at throughout the Odyssey. Um, the gods often came disguised as someone else in order to allow the humans to figure out on their own what they needed to do with just a little bit of encouragement, a little bit of a push. Because if the gods came down, like Athena just came down as Athena and said to Telemachus, I'm Athena and I know all the answers and I'm going to work this out for you, then that wouldn't allow Telemachus to grow into his own knowledge. He'd feel that he had just been given a gift from the gods and that she had sorted things out for him. But in going as disguised, she goes disguised as an old man, not even a woman, an old man claiming to be his father's old friend. And this allows her to nudge Telemachus without him knowing that it's a goddess who's actually intervening on his behalf. Now, before we move forward on that, I just want to pause for a moment and say a few words about that. Because can you imagine if the Greeks believed, as they did, and obviously as Homer did, and all of the gods did, all of them did, all of the humans did, that the gods at any time could appear in human guise. If you, sorry about this lighting, if in fact you believed that anyone could be a god in disguise, it explains quite a bit why the idea of Greek hospitality was so important, because the Greeks never wanted to offend a god. And if anyone could be a god, then certainly they wouldn't offend anyone. So if a stranger appeared on their shore, they would welcome them and with great hospitality, often giving them gifts, treating them to feast, and wine was a big part of that, giving them the best place at the table. And I think there's something very charming about that tradition. And I often think about that song years ago. There was a song, What If God Was One of Us, just a stranger on a bus? How would we treat that stranger? Um, and if we knew that it was God, then certainly we might treat that stranger differently than if we didn't. But for the Greeks, they assumed that any stranger could be a god. So the idea of Greek hospitality becomes very much a part of Greek culture. And that's something you could notice throughout the book, this idea of Greek culture and Greek hospitality. Take note of where you notice it, and maybe that's something you'd like to include in our wiki. But anyway, she comes as this old friend, and she says on the middle of page 83, line around 210, my own name is Mentis. Um, and she says, um, as for the ties between your father and myself, we've been friends forever, which is, of course, entirely true because she's a goddess and she's immortal. So it's just a little kind of hint she gives, but it's sort of a sweet little thing she says, that we've been friends forever. I'm proud to say, and he would hear me out, that if you went and questioned old Lord Laertes, he would confirm this. Laertes is Odysseus's father. So she's claiming to be an old friend, but it's this charming little way she says, we've been friends forever, which indicates to the reader that she's immortal in a way. I mean, we know that because we know that she's disguising herself. But then she goes on at the bottom of that page to say, um, yet I tell you, great Odysseus, again, the epitaph, great, um, great Odysseus is not dead. He's still alive. And turning over to page 84, somewhere in this wide world, held captive out at sea on a wave-washed land, and hard men, savages, somehow hold him back against his will. Wait, I'll make you a prophecy. Now that's very interesting because she is a god, so she could make a prophecy. One of the immortal gods have planted it in my mind. Well, of course, she's the immortal god who has it in her mind. It will come true. I think, though I am hardly a seer or knower the flights of birds, he won't be gone long from the native land he loves, which is Ithaca, and not even if iron shackles bind your father down. He's plodding away to journey home at last. He's never at a loss. What's so sweet about this is that we see Athena's affection for Odysseus. She says he's never at a loss, he's planning his journey now, and then she says, "But please tell me about yourself. You're truly Odysseus's son. You've sprung up so." Now, poor Telemachus, imagine that you're a young man, maybe some of you young men in the class can relate to this, that you know, you know what your father has accomplished, or you are very proud of sort of your father, and yet you always sort of have to think, how do I measure up? Or do I measure up? Or how can I be my own person? And until maybe even you've come away to college, that's been very difficult for you. Sometimes, as Telemachus will have to do, you have to go away from what's familiar to grow up, to become the man that you're meant to be. Not that your father is, because Telemachus is not going to go off and fight in the Trojan War, but he will become a man in his own right, and he's going to protect his mother from these suitors that are taking over the um, the homeland. So perhaps some of you young men can relate to that. So the nice thing is that Telemachus himself is quite a modest young man. Excuse me, my nose is a bit itchy. Modest young man, and he says, um, "Mother has always told me so, that I'm his son. It's true, but I'm not so certain. Who on his own has ever really known who gave him life? You see, this is a young man who has never known his father. He yearns to think that he's like his father, but he's not sure. He's not confident. And so this is the early Telemachus. And if you were interested in the character of Telemachus, you might want to point out that this is who he is at the beginning of the poem. And then we see who he is when he comes back from his own journey. And I think that the last thing I'd just like to say that, I've tried to point out some of the ways in which I would read a book of the poem. I'd look for some indication of Greek culture, which I'm going to point out in a minute, the gods, indications of the epitaphs, what Homer would like us to know. Um, there could be indications in a book about location or geography. But um, before I get to that, I just want to turn to, again, um, the advice that she gives him and the reason she's actually, as she told Zeus, come down to Ithaca. Um, yes, on page 87 at the top, around lines 340. You must not cling to your boyhood any longer. It's time you were a man. So, in effect, Athena has come to say, buck up, just pull yourself together. It's time you became a man, Telemachus. And she's giving him sort of the strength to do that. Um, he says, "O stranger, heedful Telemachus replied." So again, that epitaph for Telemachus is heedful. He's listening to her. Heedful Telemachus, indeed I will. You've counseled me with so much kindness, like a father to a son. So she's almost taken on the role of Telemachus's father, Odysseus, in order to help him to grow up, because Odysseus isn't there to help him. Um, Her eyes glinting, Pallas declined um, to stay. And then he says to her, I would like to give you a gift. And she says, as for the gift, whatever you'd give in kindness, save it for my return so I can take it home. Choose something rare and find, and a good reward that gift is going to bring you. So he wants to give any stranger a gift, his guest, and she declines and says that that will bring you luck to yourself. And if you look over to page 89, um, there are other um, little indications of the life that Odysseus has left behind. We see in the middle of that page that Penelope is crying. She's weeping. Her beloved husband. She fell to weeping for Odysseus, her beloved husband, until watchful Athena. So there's another epitaph for Athena. She's watching over them. Watchful Athena sealed her eyes with a welcome sleep. So she gave Penelope the gift of sleep to get through the pain of missing her husband. And finally, at the end of this book, um, she gives Telemachus again this sort of courage to start out on his own Odyssey, his own mini Odyssey, the sort of Odyssey within the Odyssey, in search of his father, who he now knows is alive and out there somewhere. And she says, he says, that there all night long, wrapped in a sheep's warm fleece, he weighed in his mind the course that Athena had charted. And in some way, Telemachus has an indication or some sort of hint that this stranger was someone more than just an old friend of his father's, or perhaps a very old friend of his father's, meaning that it was, in fact, the goddess Athena. So I hope that gives you kind of a roadmap to how to read one of the books moving forward. You now have 2 through 6 to read, since we kind of went through book 1 together. And look for my example on the wiki of how I would pick something out of one of the books and write about it, making sure, please, to stay close to the text by quoting specific lines that you're then kind of bringing to our attention on the wiki and elaborating on. So for now, that's hopefully a good place for you to begin your own odyssey or journey through the poem.